December 8th, 1939. A freezing conference room in the Château de Vignoles, 40 miles northeast of Paris. 3 Polish mathematicians sat across from their British and French counterparts, about to reveal a secret that would alter the course of human history. Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosiecki, and Henryk Zagalski had arrived carrying wooden boxes containing something the Western Allies believed impossible: the internal workings of Germany's supposedly unbreakable Enigma cipher machine. The British cryptanalysts, accustomed to thinking of themselves as the world's finest codebreakers, were about to receive a lesson in mathematical brilliance that would humble them completely and simultaneously offer the slender thread of hope Britain desperately needed. What these 3 quiet Polish mathematicians had achieved in isolation, working with minimal resources in the basement of the Polish General Staff headquarters in Warsaw, would become the foundation for the most consequential intelligence operation of World War II. They had cracked Enigma before the war even began. Now, with Poland crushed under German occupation, they were handing the keys to victory to allies who hadn't believed the lock could be picked. The story begins not in the romantic setting of an English country estate, but in the prosaic offices of the Polish Cipher Bureau in Warsaw during January 1929. While most cryptographic services focused on diplomatic codes, the Poles understood something their Western neighbours had missed. Germany, humiliated by Versailles and seething with revanchist ambition, represented an existential threat to Polish independence. Understanding German military communications wasn't merely useful, it was survival. The Polish intelligence service, the Büroschiffrau, operated under conditions that would have seemed impossible to their better-funded British counterparts. Poland, reborn in 1918, after more than a century of partition, possessed neither the imperial resources of Britain nor the industrial might of France. What they did possess was mathematical talent and desperate motivation. The combination would prove decisive. When the German military began using Enigma machines for operational communications in the late 1920s, the Polish Cipher Bureau recognized the threat immediately. The device, commercially available since 1923, seemed impossible to compromise. Arthur Scherbius, the German engineer who invented Enigma, had created a machine that scrambled messages through a combination of rotating wheels, a plug board, and a reflector. The mathematical complexity was staggering. A 3-rotor military Enigma machine with a plug board offered more than 150 million possible settings. To put this in perspective, if 1,000 cryptanalysts tested one setting every second, working around the clock, it would take longer than twice the age of the universe to test every possibility. Scherbius died in 1929, never knowing that his invention would become the history's most famous cipher machine, but not for the reasons he imagined. The Polish approach to Enigma differed fundamentally from traditional cryptanalysis. Instead of recruiting linguists and classicists skilled in ancient languages and literary analysis, as the British would do, the Poles turned to mathematicians. In 1929, Professor Zdzisław Krygowski at Poznan University began teaching a secret cryptology course to his most promising mathematics students. Among them was Marian Rejewski, a 23-year-old who had just completed his master's degree in mathematics. Rejewski possessed a mind that could perceive patterns in apparent chaos, could reduce seemingly impossible complexity to elegant mathematical relationships. He would need every ounce of this talent. Rejewski joined the Cipher Bureau in 1932, assigned specifically to the Enigma problem. His predecessors had made no progress. The machine's internal wiring remained unknown, and without knowing how each rotor scrambled the alphabet, mathematical analysis seemed impossible. Then, in late 1932, French intelligence delivered information obtained from a German traitor named Hans Thilo Schmidt. Schmidt, codename Asher, had provided documents including Enigma key settings for September and October 1932, and critically, information about the machine's internal structure. The French cryptographic service couldn't exploit this intelligence. They handed it to the Poles, believing it worthless. Rejewski proved them wrong. Working alone in a Warsaw basement office during December 1932, Rejewski performed what remains one of the most brilliant individual achievements in the history of cryptanalysis. Using the key settings from Schmidt's documents, he analyzed how Enigma transformed letters and identified mathematical relationships in the patterns. Most cryptanalysts would have seen random chaos. Rejewski saw group theory, permutations, and cycles. Within weeks, he had deduced the complete internal wiring of the military Enigma's rotors, something the Germans believed mathematically impossible for an outsider to determine. By January 1933, less than 2 months after beginning his analysis, Rejewski could read German military messages. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. The Poles were already reading his military's communications. The achievement was so extraordinary that when Rejewski's work was finally declassified in the 1970s, cryptographic historians struggled to comprehend how one man, working alone with minimal information, had defeated a machine the Germans considered unbreakable. Rejewski had accomplished in 6 weeks what Britain's government code and cipher school would later require hundreds of personnel and industrial-scale machinery to replicate. The mathematical elegance of his solution remains studied in universities today. He had transformed cryptanalysis from an art into a science, from linguistic intuition into mathematical certainty. But Rejewski understood something crucial that would determine the entire future of signals intelligence. Breaking Enigma once wasn't enough. The Germans changed their key settings daily. Every morning at midnight, German radio operators switched to new rotor positions, new plugboard connections, new reflector settings. Without knowing these daily keys, yesterday's breakthrough became today's useless knowledge. Rejewski needed a system to recover each day's settings quickly enough to read that day's traffic. The race against time had begun. Rejewski and his colleagues Rejewski and Zagalski developed a solution called the cyclometer, a device that could identify patterns in Enigma encryptions and narrow down the possible daily settings. By 1938, they had refined this into a system using perforated sheets, now called Zagalski sheets, which could determine settings through a process of elimination. At their peak efficiency, the 3 mathematicians and their small team of assistants could break most German military Enigma traffic within a few hours. Poland was reading German Army and Air Force communications routinely, providing intelligence that revealed Hitler's intentions with remarkable clarity. The intelligence harvest was extraordinary. During the 1938 Czechoslovak crisis, Polish cryptanalysts read German military preparations in real time, understanding that Hitler was bluffing when he threatened war if the Sudetenland wasn't surrendered. When Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Polish intelligence knew it was coming days in advance. Most critically, as German forces massed on Poland's borders during the summer of 1939, the Poles read the operational orders, the timetables, the unit dispositions. They knew the attack was coming. What they couldn't do was stop it. September 1st, 1939, brought the lightning war that shattered Poland in weeks. German forces, their communications secured by Enigma, or so they believed, executed Vollweiss with devastating efficiency. The Polish Cipher Bureau had prepared for this moment. Before the invasion, they had smuggled duplicate Enigma machines and their cryptanalytic materials to Romania. Rejewski, Rejewski, and Zagalski escaped Warsaw as German artillery pounded the city. They made their way through Romania to France, carrying in their heads the mathematical keys to Germany's most secret communications. The meeting at the Château de Vignoles on December 8, 1939, was the moment when the Polish gift reached the Allies, who could exploit it on a global scale. The British representatives included Alistair Denniston, head of the Government Code and Cipher School, and Dilly Knox, one of Britain's most experienced cryptanalysts. Knox, who had broken Soviet codes in the 1920s, considered himself among the world's elite codebreakers. The Pole's revelation shattered his assumptions. When Rejewski explained his mathematical approach to the rotor wiring problem, demonstrating how group theory and permutation analysis had defeated the machine, Knox reportedly sat in stunned silence. The British had been approaching Enigma as a linguistic puzzle, attempting to break it through letter frequency analysis and linguistic intuition. The Poles had recognized it as pure mathematics and solved it with mathematical precision. The Poles handed over everything: the rotor wirings, the cryptanalytic techniques, the Zygalski sheets, documentation of 6 years of successful decryption. Most importantly, they explained that their methods were failing. Germany had increased Enigma's security in stages throughout 1938 and 1939. The number of rotors in the machine's stock had increased from 3 to 5, meaning operators selected 3 rotors from a set of 5, vastly increasing the number of possible configurations. The plugboard connections had increased from 6 to 10, multiplying the permutations. German operators had improved their procedures, closing loopholes the Poles had exploited. By late 1939, the Polish methods were producing diminishing returns. The Zygalski sheets, which had worked brilliantly when 3 rotors existed, now required an impossible number of sheets to cover 5 rotor configurations. The Germans were winning the cryptographic arms race through sheer complexity. The British returned to Bletchley Park, the Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London that had become the home of the government code and cipher school, carrying the Polish legacy and understanding they needed to industrialize codebreaking on a scale never before attempted. Bletchley Park in early 1940 was barely recognizable as the intelligence factory it would become. A few dozen cryptanalysts worked in the mansion's rooms, many of them academics recruited from Cambridge and Oxford. Dilly Knox worked in a cottage in the grounds, wrapped in blankets against the cold, attacking German naval Enigma with the linguistic methods that had served him for decades. The Polish revelations changed everything. Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley Park on September 4th, 1939, 3 days after the war began. The 27-year-old mathematician had already established himself as a brilliant theoretical thinker, having published his seminal paper on computable numbers in 1936. What Turing brought to Bletchley was the ability to think about problems in entirely new ways, to imagine solutions that didn't yet exist, to design machines that could perform intellectual tasks previously restricted to human minds. When he learned of the Polish achievements and understood that the German security improvements were overwhelming manual cryptanalysis, Turing conceived of something revolutionary. He would build a machine to break Enigma at industrial speed. The device Turing designed, called the Bombay, was unlike anything that had existed before. It wasn't a computer in the modern sense, but rather an electromechanical logic machine designed to exploit a fundamental weakness in Enigma that Rejewski had identified and Turing refined. The weakness was that Enigma's reciprocal nature meant that if pressing A produced B, then pressing B would produce A with the same machine settings. This reciprocity, combined with the fact that no letter could ever encrypt to itself, created logical contradictions that Turing's machine could detect. The Bombay would test rotor positions at high speed, eliminating impossible settings until only the correct daily key remained. The first prototype Bombay, called Victory, began operation on March 14, 1940. It was approximately 7 feet tall, 8 feet wide, weighed more than a ton, and contained 90 rotating drums that simulated 30 Enigma rotors. 3 rotors for each of 10 simulated Enigma machines working in parallel. The rotating drums clicked and clattered through thousands of settings per minute, far faster than any human could test them. When the machine detected a logical stop, a possible correct setting, it would halt for operators to test whether real decryption was possible. The early bombs were temperamental, prone to mechanical failures, and couldn't handle all Enigma variants. but they worked. Gordon Welchman, a mathematician from Cambridge who arrived at Bletchley in September 1939, made the crucial improvement that transformed the Bombay from promising to decisive. Welchman recognized that the Enigma's plugboard, which the Poles had struggled to integrate into their automated approaches, could be exploited rather than worked around. He designed an additional component called the diagonal board that dramatically increased the Bombay's efficiency. With Welchman's enhancement, the Bombay could find daily keys in hours rather than days. By August 1940, improved Bombays were arriving at Bletchley Park, and the production never stopped. Eventually, more than 200 Bombays would operate across multiple sites, running 24 hours daily, consuming enormous amounts of electricity and requiring constant maintenance by teams of engineers and operators, mostly women from the Women's Royal Naval Service. The code-breaking process at Bletchley Park evolved into an industrial operation that bore no resemblance to the romantic image of solitary geniuses having sudden insights. Each day began with German radio operators across occupied Europe switching to new Enigma settings at midnight. British radio intercept stations, called Y stations, scattered across Britain and around the world, would immediately begin capturing German radio traffic. These intercepts arrived at Bletchley within hours by motorcycle courier or teleprinter. Cryptanalysts in Hut 6, the section responsible for German Army and Air Force Enigma, would analyze the traffic looking for cribs, known or guessed plaintext that appeared in the encrypted messages. German operators were creatures of habit, often beginning messages with standard phrases like weather report or ending with Heil Hitler. These predictable patterns became the cribs that made Bombay runs possible. Once a promising crib was identified, Bombay operators would configure a machine to test settings consistent with that crib. The Bombay would run for minutes or hours, stopping when it detected possible solutions. These stops would be tested by hand on a checking machine. Most stops were false alarms, logical contradictions that disappeared when tested against actual messages. But when a true stop was found, when the daily key was recovered, the floodgates opened. Every message encrypted with those settings that day could now be read. The raw decrypts would flow to intelligence analysts who would translate them, identify relevant information, and forward critical intelligence to commanders who could act on it. The intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts was codenamed Ultra, and it began affecting the war's course in ways both dramatic and subtle during 1940 and 1941. When Germany prepared to invade Norway in April 1940, Enigma decrypts provided warnings that British commanders tragically ignored. When the Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain in July 1940, RAF commanders received daily intelligence on German raid compositions, target priorities, and aircraft availability. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, could position his limited fighter resources with precision because he knew where the Germans would attack before they took off. The margin was narrow. Britain couldn't afford to waste fighters on empty sky. Ultra meant they didn't have to. But the real test of Enigma intelligence came at sea, where the battle was most desperate and the stakes most immediate. Britain depended absolutely on Atlantic convoys bringing food, fuel, and weapons from America. German U-boats, coordinated by Admiral Dönitz in Wolfpack tactics, were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. During 1940 and 1941, losses mounted toward catastrophic levels. Dönitz's submarines, operating under radio instructions encrypted by naval Enigma, were hunting with devastating efficiency. British naval intelligence could hear the German radio traffic, but couldn't read it. Naval Enigma used additional security measures, including a fourth rotor and more complex key distribution procedures. It remained unbroken. The breakthrough came from desperation and extraordinary courage. On May 9, 1941, the destroyer HMS Bulldog forced the German submarine, U-110, to surface with depth charges after a convoy attack south of Iceland. Instead of immediately sinking, the U-boat wallowed on the surface, her crew abandoning ship under the impression she was about to founder. Sub-Lieutenant David Balmy led a boarding party that entered the submarine while it remained afloat. Inside, they found Enigma machines, codebooks, and key tables. The Germans hadn't scuttled their vessel properly. The Royal Navy had captured intact the materials needed to break naval Enigma. The captured materials reached Bletchley Park on May 13th. Within days, Hut 8, the section responsible for naval Enigma, began reading German naval traffic. The impact was immediate. Convoy routing intelligence derived from decrypted U-boat position reports allowed British naval commanders to route convoys around known submarine concentrations. Ships that would have sailed into Wolfpack ambushes were diverted to safe routes. The sinking rate dropped sharply. From June through December 1941, Allied shipping losses fell to levels Germany couldn't replace with new submarine production. Dönitz couldn't understand why his boats were finding empty ocean. The carefully positioned patrol lines that should have intercepted convoys found nothing. His submarines were hunting where the convoys weren't, because British intelligence knew where his boats were waiting. The statistical evidence of Ultra's impact on the Battle of the Atlantic is stark and undeniable. In May 1941, before naval Enigma was broken, U-boats sank 43 ships totaling over 230,000 tons. In June, after decrypts began affecting convoy routing, sinking fell to 31 ships totaling 130,000 tons. The decline continued. By July, just 23 ships were lost. The pattern repeated whenever Bletchley could read naval Enigma consistently. When blackouts occurred, when German security changes or procedural improvements temporarily blinded the codebreakers, sinking rates immediately increased. When decrypts resumed, losses dropped. The correlation was undeniable to post-war analysts examining the evidence. But maintaining the ability to read naval Enigma required constant innovation as the Germans improved security. On February 1st, 1942, German U-boats switched to a new Enigma variant called Triton by the Germans and Shark by Bletchley Park that added a fourth rotor to the machine. This change created a cryptographic blackout that lasted 10 months. Existing three-rotor bombers couldn't attack four-rotor Enigma efficiently. The number of possible settings had multiplied by a factor of 26. Bletchley's industrial code-breaking system, which had been producing regular decrypts, went blind just as America entered the war and U-boat operations expanded along the American coast. The blackout's impact was catastrophic. During the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats operating in American waters, where naval commanders had no experience with submarine warfare and initially refused to implement convoys or blackouts, sank over 500 ships. Dönitz called it the second happy time. His submarines operated with impunity off American cities, whose lights silhouetted merchant ships perfectly for torpedo attacks. Without Enigma intelligence, Allied naval forces were nearly helpless. The Germans appeared to have won the cryptographic battle. The breakthrough came from another desperate boarding action. On October 30th, 1942, the destroyer HMS Petard engaged the German submarine U-559 in the eastern Mediterranean. After hours of depth charging, the U-boat surfaced. Once again, a British boarding party entered a sinking submarine. Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier descended into the flooding submarine to retrieve cryptographic materials. They passed codebooks and an Enigma machine to their comrades before the submarine sank, taking both men with her. They were awarded the George Cross posthumously. The materials they died obtaining reached Bletchley Park within days. The captured four-rotor materials allowed Bletchley's cryptanalysts to understand how Shark differed from the three-rotor naval Enigma. Alan Turing and his colleagues designed new four-rotor bombers capable of attacking the enhanced cipher. The first four-rotor bombe became operational in early December 1942. On December 13th, exactly 10 months after the blackout began, Hut 8 broke back into Shark. The decrypts flowed again. Convoy routing intelligence resumed. U-boat sinking rates immediately declined. The statistics from 1943 demonstrate Ultra's decisive impact with brutal clarity. During March 1943, U-boats sank 108 ships, the highest monthly loss of the entire war. Dönitz had 360 operational submarines, and they were winning. Then Bletchley's productivity peaked. Bomb production had increased to the point where virtually all intercepted Enigma traffic could be tested. Decryption occurred within hours of message transmission. By May 1943, convoy routing based on ultra-intelligence had become so effective that U-boats were finding empty ocean repeatedly. Dönitz's carefully planned patrol lines intercepted nothing. His submarines burned fuel searching for convoys that intelligence had routed around them. May 1943 marked the turning point. The Allies sank 41 U-boats that month, losses Dönitz couldn't sustain. On May 24th, he withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic, admitting temporary defeat. He never knew why his boats were failing. The Germans suspected radar, which had indeed improved dramatically. They suspected long-range patrol aircraft, which were closing the mid-Atlantic gap. They suspected better anti-submarine weapons, which were indeed more effective. They never suspected their communications were being read in real time. The possibility that Enigma had been broken was inconceivable. The machine was mathematically unbreakable. Thousands of the Reich's best engineers and mathematicians had certified it. The British couldn't possibly have the mathematical talent to break it, except they did, inheriting that talent from 3 Polish mathematicians who had solved the impossible before the war began. The intelligence derived from Enigma affected every theatre of war by 1943 and 1944. In North Africa, Rommel's supply situation was known in detail because his logistics requests were encrypted by Enigma. British commanders knew his fuel status, ammunition reserves, reinforcement schedules. They knew he was reading American diplomatic codes that revealed British positions, allowing them to feed him misinformation. In the Mediterranean, Italian naval movements encrypted by their version of Enigma were read consistently, allowing the Royal Navy to ambush convoys and avoid superior forces. During the preparations for D-Day, Enigma decrypts revealed that the German High Command believed the fictional 1st United States Army Group threatened the Pas-de-Calais, proving the deception operation was succeeding. The scale of the Bletchley Park operation by 1944 defied comparison with anything that had existed before. More than 9,000 personnel worked on the site, mostly women, performing tasks from Bombay operation to traffic analysis to translation. The mansion itself had been supplemented by dozens of temporary wooden huts, housing specialized sections. Hut 6 broke German Army and Air Force Enigma. Hut 8 handled Naval Enigma. Hut 3 translated and analyzed Army and Air Force decrypts. Hut 4 did the same for naval traffic. Other huts broke German teleprinter ciphers, Italian codes, Japanese diplomatic traffic. The operation consumed enormous resources. The bombers alone drew enough electricity to power a small town. The secrecy was absolute. Personnel were forbidden from discussing their work, even with colleagues in different sections. What happened in the huts stayed in the huts. The security measures surrounding Ultra were as sophisticated as the cryptanalysis itself. Every decrypt was classified at the highest level. Distribution was restricted to a handful of senior commanders who had signed documents acknowledging that compromise would result in courts-martial. Intelligence derived from decrypts could never be acted upon in ways that might reveal the source. If an Enigma decrypt revealed a German convoy would sail at a specific time, British forces couldn't simply attack it. That would indicate the sailing time had been compromised. Instead, reconnaissance aircraft would be sent to visibly locate the convoy, establishing a plausible alternative source for the intelligence. Only then could an attack proceed. These security measures, codenamed the ultra-secret, held throughout the war and for 3 decades afterwards. The cost of maintaining the ultra-secret included accepting losses that might have been prevented. When Enigma decrypts revealed German bombing raids on British cities, RAF fighters could be positioned to intercept, but not too efficiently. A perfect intercept rate would reveal impossible foreknowledge. Some bombers had to get through to maintain the deception that British defences relied on radar alone. This terrible mathematics of acceptable loss troubled everyone involved, but was never compromised. Churchill, who received daily summaries of Enigma intelligence in his personal red boxes, understood that the source was more valuable than any single battle. Protecting Ultra meant accepting casualties today to ensure intelligence tomorrow. The German Navy's failure to recognize that Enigma was broken remains one of the war's great intelligence failures. Dönitz and his staff repeatedly analyzed why their submarines were failing. They investigated whether British radar could detect submarines at greater ranges than German technology indicated. They improved submarine snorkels to allow underwater diesel operation. They developed acoustic torpedoes to target the escorts. They never seriously investigated whether Enigma was compromised, because the mathematical impossibility of breaking it was doctrine. When the head of the Beobachtungsdienst, the German Naval Intelligence Service, suggested in 1943 that Enigma might be broken, he was dismissed as defeatist. The investigation concluded that breaking Enigma would require testing 100 million settings per day, an impossible task. They didn't know about bombies testing thousands of settings per minute. This systematic German failure to imagine that their cipher security was compromised stemmed partly from hubris and partly from reasonable assumptions that proved tragically wrong. The Germans knew the Poles had been working on Enigma before the war, but believed the increased security measures implemented in 1938 and 1939 had rendered any Polish progress obsolete. They assumed the Poles had relied on captured or purchased Enigma machines, not knowing that Rejewski had deduced the rotor wirings mathematically from encrypted traffic alone. They assumed that breaking current Enigma would require solving the same problems that stumped cryptanalysts in the 1920s, not knowing that the mathematical revolution Rejewski began and Turing industrialized had transformed codebreaking from art to engineering. The contribution of the Poles to Ultra remained unknown for 3 decades after the war. When the British government began declassifying Enigma intelligence in the 1970s, initial accounts credited British cryptanalysts with breaking the cipher. Rejewski, Rejewski, and Zagalski received no mention. Rejewski had died in January 1942 when a ship carrying him from Algeria to France sank in the Mediterranean. Zagalski had survived the war working for British intelligence in England and later settled in Britain, teaching mathematics. Rejewski had survived the war in hiding in occupied France and returned to Poland, working as an accountant because his cryptographic work remained classified by both British and Polish authorities. In 1974, retired Royal Air Force officer Gustave Bertrand, who had been the French liaison with the Polish cryptanalysts before the war, published a book that revealed the Polish contribution. The revelation stunned military historians, who had credited the British with breaking Enigma independently. Rejewski, then 72 years old and living in Warsaw, was finally acknowledged as the man who had first broken the unbreakable cipher. British cryptanalysts who had believed their wartime achievements represented original innovation learned that they had been building on a Polish foundation laid years before they began. Rejewski received belated recognition from the Polish government and from international cryptographic societies. He died in 1980, having spent 36 years unable to discuss his greatest achievement because of official secrecy. The statistical evidence of how Enigma intelligence affected the war's outcome has been analysed extensively since declassification. Historians estimate that Ultra shortened the war in Europe by approximately 2 years. In the Battle of the Atlantic specifically, post-war analysis indicates that convoy routing based on Enigma intelligence saved between 600 and 1,000 merchant ships that would otherwise have been sunk. Each ship represented not just steel and cargo, but lives, typically 40 to 60 crew members per vessel. The mathematics is grim, but clear. Ultra saved thousands of merchant seamen from death in torpedo attacks. The technology developed at Bletchley Park influenced post-war computing development in ways that echoed for decades. The Colossus machines, built to break German teleprinter ciphers, more sophisticated than Enigma, were genuine programmable electronic computers, arguably the world's first. Tommy Flowers, the engineer who designed Colossus, pioneered vacuum tube computing on a scale never attempted before. The 10 Colossus machines operating by war's end used 2,400 vacuum tubes each and could process 5,000 characters per second, speeds that seemed impossible to contemporary engineers. Alan Turing's theoretical work on computation, refined through his practical code-breaking experience, laid groundwork for modern computer science. The intellectual infrastructure of cryptanalysis, the combination of mathematics and engineering applied to information problems, became the foundation for the computer revolution. The human cost of Enigma's breaking included sacrifices beyond those who died, retrieving cipher materials from sinking submarines. The thousands of Bletchley personnel who maintained absolute secrecy about their work couldn't discuss their wartime achievements with anyone for 30 years. Men and women who had made crucial contributions to victory were unknown, unrecognized, unable to explain their absence from military service or their mysterious war work. Some were dismissed as shirkers by those who didn't know they had served in uniform. The psychological burden of this enforced silence affected many deeply. When the ultra-secret was finally revealed, elderly former Bletchley workers could finally explain to their families what they had done during the war. The operational impact of Ultra at the tactical level came from enabling commanders to anticipate enemy actions with impossible precision. During the Normandy campaign, German reinforcement movements encrypted by Enigma were known to Allied commanders before the units arrived. This allowed concentrated air attacks on moving columns and ambushes at choke points. German commanders couldn't understand how Allied forces consistently appeared where they were most vulnerable. The concept that their own communications were guiding enemy dispositions never occurred to them. The security of Enigma was an article of faith in the Wehrmacht, certified by Germany's finest technical minds, reinforced by continuous use without apparent compromise. The final assessment of the Polish contribution to Allied victory must acknowledge that without Rejewski's breakthrough in 1932, British cryptanalysts would have faced a problem they might never have solved in time to affect the war. The mathematical approach Rejewski pioneered was essential. Traditional linguistic cryptanalysis couldn't have broken Enigma's machine-generated ciphers. Turing and his colleagues built on Rejewski's foundation, industrialized his methods, and adapted to German security improvements. But the foundation was Polish, laid by 3 mathematicians working in isolation with minimal resources, driven by the knowledge that their nation's survival depended on understanding the enemy's intentions. The story of Enigma's breaking traces an arc from mathematical brilliance to industrial-scale intelligence production to strategic impact that determined the war's outcome. Marian Rejewski's solitary work in a Warsaw basement during December 1932 became the Bombay factories of 1943, employing thousands, became the ultra-intelligence that routed convoys around submarines and guided armies across Europe. The transformation of cryptanalysis from a craft performed by linguistic scholars into an industrial engineering discipline requiring mathematicians, engineers, and factory production revolutionized intelligence forever. Every modern signals intelligence service descends from the organization created at Bletchley Park, inheriting its methods, its scale, and its understanding that breaking codes requires building systems, not solving puzzles. The German leadership's failure to recognize that Enigma had been compromised represented an intelligence catastrophe of historic proportions. They possessed the technical capability to improve security further or switch to different cipher systems. They never did because they believed improvement was unnecessary. The cipher was perfect. The mathematics proved it. The British couldn't break it because the British couldn't possibly possess the mathematical sophistication required. This combination of hubris and ignorance cost Germany the intelligence war, cost them secure communications, cost them the ability to coordinate operations without the enemy reading their orders. In a war where logistics and coordination determined outcomes, this blindness proved fatal. The thousands of lives saved by Enigma intelligence extend beyond merchant seamen in the Atlantic. RAF pilots who intercepted Luftwaffe raids guided by ultra-intelligence survived battles they might have lost without foreknowledge. Soldiers who fought German units, whose positions and strength were known through decrypts, faced enemies whose surprise was negated by intelligence. The mathematics of lives saved cannot be calculated precisely, but certainly exceeds tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands. Each convoy, routed around submarine patrol lines, carried hundreds of men who would have drowned if German torpedoes had found them. Each German formation, ambushed because its movement orders had been decrypted, represented Allied lives, preserved because the battle occurred, at times, and places Allied commanders chose. The legacy of Enigma extends beyond World War II into the fundamental structure of modern cryptography and computing. The recognition that cipher machines could be broken by other machines launched the computing revolution. The understanding that security required continuous innovation against evolving threats became doctrine. The integration of mathematics and engineering to solve information problems created disciplines that dominate the modern world. The organizational innovations at Bletchley Park, the division of labor between intercept, cryptanalysis, translation, and intelligence analysis, became standard practice in signals intelligence worldwide. Every secure communication system today exists because Enigma failed, because its breaking taught the world that mathematical security requires constant vigilance against mathematical attack. When the wooden boxes containing Enigma machines and cryptanalytic materials passed from Polish to British hands in December 1939, they carried more than physical objects. They carried mathematical knowledge, operational experience, and proof that the impossible could be achieved. The three Polish mathematicians who handed over their secrets couldn't have known their gift would become the foundation for an intelligence operation employing thousands and affecting every theatre of the global war. They knew only that their nation was defeated, that they couldn't exploit their breakthrough alone, and that their allies needed what they had learned. The generosity of sharing knowledge that represented years of work, knowledge that might have been hoarded, knowledge that represented Poland's only meaningful contribution to the Allied war effort after military defeat, stands as one of the war's remarkable moments of international cooperation. Bletchley Park employed women in critical roles decades before most organizations recognized female capability. It recruited talent from universities without regard for social class. It promoted based on ability rather than family connections. The meritocratic efficiency of the operation contrasted sharply with the Nazi system, where ideology trumped competence and paranoia prevented sharing information. The Allies won the intelligence war partly because they could mobilize intellectual resources across society, while the Germans restricted their talent pool to ideologically acceptable candidates. The final toll of the Battle of the Atlantic demonstrates what was at stake when convoys sailed into U-boat patrol zones. Germany sank approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships during the war, killing more than 30,000 merchant seamen. The peak-killing months of 1942, when Enigma was blacked out, saw hundreds of ships torpedoed. The decline in losses after Enigma was broken saved perhaps 1,000 ships and 10,000 lives. Conservative estimates based on comparing loss rates during blackout periods to rates when decrypts were available. Each ship that sailed safely to Britain because intelligence had routed it around submarines carried cargo that kept Britain fighting, food that prevented starvation, fuel that powered aircraft, weapons that equipped armies. The story of Enigma reaches its conclusion not in dramatic battlefield victories, but in the unglamorous mathematics of logistics and attrition. Germany couldn't sink enough ships because convoys avoided submarines. Germany couldn't concentrate forces effectively because their movement orders were being read. Germany couldn't maintain security because their unbreakable cipher was broken. The accumulation of small advantages derived from signals intelligence, ships saved, ambushes avoided, reinforcements interrupted, created strategic superiority that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The Wehrmacht was fighting blind against enemies who could see, coordinating operations through communications the enemy was reading, trusting cipher security that had failed years before the war began. From Marian Rejewski's basement office in Warsaw to the bomber factories of Bletchley Park to the convoy routes of the North Atlantic, the breaking of Enigma changed warfare forever. The Poles proved the cipher could be broken. The British proved it could be broken at industrial scale. The Allies proved that signals intelligence could determine strategic outcomes. The Germans proved that technological superiority means nothing if the enemy knows your plans. These lessons, written in the mathematics of permutations and the statistics of convoy losses, remain relevant today as nations struggle to secure communications against adversaries with unlimited computing power. The fundamental tension Enigma revealed that perfect security is impossible when communications must be intercepted, and that breaking security requires building systems more complex than the security itself, defines modern cryptography. Every encrypted message sent today exists in the shadow of Enigma, protected by mathematics more sophisticated, but vulnerable to attackers more capable. The eternal race between concealment and revelation that 3 Polish mathematicians and thousands of British codebreakers won decisively between 1932 and 1945